Welcome to this discussion on charting pathways to enable net zero. What role for hydrogen? This event has been organized by Hydrogen for EU in partnership with EURACTIV. You can follow the discussion at hashtag EA Debates, and please tweet your comments there using the hashtag, and our social media team will respond to you directly. And to ask questions, go to the chat section and use the ask button. 1 year after its release, the EU hydrogen strategy continues to be the center of debate on where, when, and how hydrogen can best support the EU's energy transition goals. The upcoming Fit for 55 package and hydrogen and gas market package will write the rules to put these ambitions into law. In this context, the recently launched Hydrogen for EU report charts potential pathways for low carbon and renewable hydrogen to contribute to the EU's goal of net zero GHG emissions by 2050, looking at the most effective mix of hydrogen technologies to be deployed across different geographies and sectors in Europe, such as power, transport, and industry, and considering factors such as cost, speed, and feasibility. It's also worth noting that this event is being held 1 week before the release of the Fit for 55 package. Now, to begin this morning, to begin today, we have the keynote address from Adina Vălean, the EU Commissioner for Transport.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts with you today on a topic that I'm following closely, hydrogen in transport. As you know, the transport sector is under pressure to cut its emissions by 90% by 2050. As our sustainable and smart mobility strategy makes clear, hitting this target means greater operational efficiency. It means having viable alternatives available, and it means the massive deployment of sustainable alternative fuels. Hydrogen is extremely valuable when direct electrification is not possible or is complicated. In road passenger transport, there is now strong market momentum for battery electric vehicles. But hydrogen fuel cells vehicles have a role to play, particularly for long-distance heavy-duty road haul. The EU is supporting this with a commitment to build 1,000 roadside hydrogen stations by 2030 and half of them by 2025. In aviation, I'm sure you're familiar with Airbus Zero-E plans, which have us all picturing hydrogen-powered short-range aircraft in service by 2035. Until that day, sustainable aviation fuels will help with immediate decarbonization, including low-carbon synthetic fuels derived from hydrogen. For waterborne transport, hydrogen is one option where we are making good progress. Another is liquid and gaseous synthetic fuels that can be derived from hydrogen. In our mobility strategy, we have the milestone of having zero-emission vessels market-ready by 2030. For rail, electrification remains the primary objective, but hydrogen, hybrid and battery-powered trains are a good alternative to diesel, where electrification makes no economic sense or is physically impossible. Europe's rail partnership will continue looking at the options, including for retrofitting regional trains. It's good to take stock of the progress, but what are we aiming for? The analysis underpinning our strategy found that for us to reach climate neutrality by 2050, hydrogen should provide around 20% of the transport fuel mix. Low-carbon synthetic fuels derived from hydrogen would need to contribute an additional 20% of the fuel mix. Today, however, hydrogen accounts for less than 2% of Europe's energy consumption and is primarily used to produce chemical products. Also, 96% of this hydrogen production is produced through natural gas, emitting CO2 in the process. This will need to change, and hydrogen needs to be increasingly produced in a cleaner way. Natural gas, coupled with advanced carbon capture and storage or usage technologies, will need to enter the market to clean up current hydrogen production and to ensure that the unprecedented volumes needed will be available for sectors where electrification is not an option. Low-carbon hydrogen is necessary to achieve our objectives on time and at lower cost for EU citizens, while strongly developing renewable hydrogen production in parallel. The potential is clear, but to fully exploit hydrogen, we need everyone pulling in the same direction. Our hydrogen strategy pledges support for the installation of at least 6 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen electrolyzers in the EU between 2020 and 2024, and the production of up to 1 million tons of renewable hydrogen. Then, between 2025 and 2030, hydrogen must become an intrinsic part of our EU energy system. We need at least 40 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen electrolyzers, and we need to be producing around 10 million tons of renewable hydrogen. The European Clean Hydrogen Alliance is taking us closer to these figures. It now counts for more than 1,400 members committed to building an entire hydrogen economy in the EU. For transport, we are about to put forward an ambitious proposal on alternative fuel infrastructure. In autumn, we also foresee modernizing our guidance for the Trans-European Transport Network, or TEN-T. So, ladies and gentlemen, the stage is set. We have a strategy, we have an alliance, and we have the political will. Europe is also home to countless talented researchers and innovators. You, the stakeholders, can also count on the European Commission's support. Hydrogen has a clear role to play in Europe's future energy mix, including for transport, and I look forward to that potential becoming a reality on our roads, in our skies, and on water.
Thanks to Commissioner Verlaine for what she said is the stage set so clearly. And to follow on with a bit more detail as well, we have with us this morning Johannes Truby. He's the Director of Economic Advisory at Deloitte. Good morning, Johannes. How are you?
Very well,
Good morning from Washington. How are you? So I'll give the floor to you, and we begin your presentation, and then we'll introduce the panel afterwards for some discussion.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to present to you today our Hydrogen for Europe study. During the next 15 minutes, I will give you some context first for the study, then present the main results, and then finally draw some important conclusions for policymakers and company leaders alike. Our study is carried out against the backdrop of what might well be the biggest energy policy challenge ever: achieving net zero emissions by 2050 as manifested in the European Green Deal. What you can see on the left-hand side are greenhouse gas emissions by sector in the European Union. That achieving net zero emissions over the next 30 years is a formidable challenge becomes clear when we look at the emission reductions over the past 30 years. Since 1990, greenhouse gas emissions have fallen by less than a quarter. And since the last tons are typically the hardest to abate, it is clear that the EU energy sector needs to step up its efforts considerably. Renewables, electrification, and energy efficiency are obvious and well-known contributors to successful decarbonization. However, it is unclear whether they're sufficient. High-temperature heat in industry, aviation, freight transport, and the variability of renewables are important challenges. And this is where hydrogen's value proposition comes into play. Not only could hydrogen help decarbonize these energy uses, but it can also, together with electrification and renewables, foster energy system integration. And this is really where our study comes into play. The objective of this research project is to assess comprehensively and in great detail the role of hydrogen in the EU energy sector transition towards net zero. One of the innovative aspects of this modeling exercise is the use of three complementary models. We're combining a classic energy system model, Times Mirrored EU, with a dedicated technology learning model called Integrate Europe, and the model of the international hydrogen trade called HYPE. The Hydrogen for Europe research project explores two pathways that lead both to carbon neutrality. The technology diversification pathway provides insights into how an inclusive approach that harnesses a wide range of decarbonization technologies can help minimizing the cost of the energy transition. The renewable push pathway examines the possible impact of a deliberate focus on renewable technologies, as we know, a prominent feature of the current policy debate. Both scenarios are aligned with the EU policy agenda and comply with the overarching energy policy goals, including the -55 target in 2030 and the European Green Deal. What is important to understand is that the results I'm going to present now should please not be interpreted as a forecast, nor as the only viable trajectories. Each pathway depicts a trajectory along which the European energy system could travel if its underlying economic, technological, and regulatory assumptions unfold in a certain way. So the objective of our pathways is to stimulate debate and illuminate strategic decision-making, but not to predict the future correctly. I would like to start the discussion of the results really high level by looking at primary energy first. Unsurprisingly, in our technology diversification pathway, the share of renewable energy more than triples in the period to 2050, with solar and wind contributing the bulk to this growth. In the renewables push pathway, not shown here, the share of renewables more than quadruples. The mirror image to this is the dwindling role of oil and coal. The combined share of the two drops to around 3% by 2050, independent of the pathway we're looking at. The only element of continuity here is natural gas. As you can see, the share of natural gas increases slightly during the transition and falls back to around 1/3 only by the end of the outlook period. Let us now take a look at the transformation of final energy consumption. Final energy consumption encompasses all the energy that is consumed in end-use appliances. For example, the electricity we're using at this very moment to power our computers is final energy. Similar for the natural gas that we're burning in the winter to heat our apartments, or the petrol that goes into the fuel tanks of our cars. The first message is that final energy consumption is falling over the next 30 years. That's the energy efficiency improvement. And the second message is that electrification is almost doubling. Again, these results are pretty independent of the pathway. Now, let's move to hydrogen. We can see that hydrogen rapidly rises to take a share of over 20% in final consumption by 2050. And if we add to this the hydrogen that is embedded in synthetic fuels and synthetic gases, we get to a combined share of hydrogen and hydrogen-related energy consumption of around 1/4 by 2050. So at the end of the outlook period, hydrogen is, after electricity, the second largest contributor to final consumption. And finally, as hydrogen soars, natural gas plummets to under 5% of end-use energy. Now, how does this relate to the resilient role of natural gas I just mentioned earlier? The answer is that natural gas shifts from being used directly to being a raw material for producing hydrogen or electricity. So in this scenario, what is lost in direct natural gas sales is partially regained in indirect natural gas use in the hydrogen and electricity sectors. Let us now look closer at the end use of hydrogen. I'm now switching to the for hydrogen more common unit of million tons. So you can see that hydrogen consumption tops 100 million tons by 2050 in both pathways. The biggest user of hydrogen is the transport sector, where hydrogen and hydrogen embedded in e-fuels, ammonia, methanol, etc., plays a key role in decarbonizing shipping, aviation, and heavy-duty transport. Here, hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels really have the advantage of a high energy density that is needed to propel big and heavy vehicles over long distances. The transport sector is followed by industry, where some 45 million tons of hydrogen are used by 2050. Hydrogen is well suited for steelmaking, where it can act as an energy source and reductant in direct reduced iron processes. Hydrogen also plays an important role in the chemical sector and various other industries where it is used for process heat and steam. Finally, hydrogen also helps decarbonizing the buildings and power sector, albeit with markedly lower quantities used. Let us now look where the hydrogen comes from. Unsurprisingly, renewable hydrogen, either from electrolysis or biomass, takes a lead role in the renewable push pathway, where we assumed binding targets for renewable energy shares of 60% in 2040 and 80% in 2050. The infrastructure needed for renewable hydrogen in Europe is gigantic. Just to give you a feeling, what you see on this slide would require between 1,000 and 1,700 gigawatts of dedicated solar PV capacity, a similar amount of wind capacity, and between 680 and 1,500 gigawatts of electrolyzers. And the challenge becomes clear when we mirror this against today's installation of about 120 gigawatts of PV and 170 gigawatts of wind capacity across the EU. The technology diversification pathway, we see that supply of low carbon hydrogen from reformers with CCS or pyrolysis is on a par with renewable hydrogen in 2050 and acts in both pathways as an important enabler of the hydrogen economy ready to supply bulk energy from the next decade. Running at higher load factors, the capacity needs for low carbon hydrogen are more modest, but still significant. Domestic production is complemented by hydrogen imports from Russia, North Africa, the Middle East, and so on. Such imports gradually ramp up over the 2030s, and by 2050, between 10 and 15% of Europe's hydrogen supply come from the international trade market. Traditional exporters of natural gas are also well placed to become major hydrogen exporters to Europe. This is notably the case for Russia and Algeria. And our modeling shows that access to existing cross-border pipeline infrastructure is a big advantage, as maritime transport is a relatively costly alternative. Yet the rise of hydrogen trade is not only good news for the incumbents, we also see some new kids on the block, notably Morocco and Tunisia. Let us now move on to answer the question how our pathways achieve the emissions trajectory towards net zero. You can see on the left-hand side that from 2030, CO2 removal solutions are burgeoning. And by the end of the outlook period, some 400 million tons of CO2 are removed. This implies that in some applications, it is so difficult to decarbonize entirely that it is cheaper to allow some emissions and then compensate these with CO2 removal elsewhere. However, this implies that the availability of carbon capture and storage technology is indispensable for achieving net zero emissions. CCS enables emission savings in a wide range of energy uses, power generation, industry, hydrogen production. And when combined with biomass, it is pretty much the only viable technology to achieve negative emissions. Storage injection needs to be capable of handling up to 1.4 gigatons of CO2. The number is a bit low in the renewable push pathway per year by 2050. CO2 injection into storage formations needs to ramp up over this decade. So there is really no time to waste around the development of this net zero enabler. As we've seen previously, enormous amounts of new energy infrastructure are needed to make the clean hydrogen economy a reality. Between 3.1 trillion euros, that's the number in the technology diversification pathway, and 5.5 trillion euros, that's the outcome of the renewable push pathway, need to be mobilized over the next 3 decades to finance the necessary investments. But the challenge is not just with investment. Our modeling also suggests that the technology diversification pathway comes at a lower total energy system cost. Specifically, we find that an approach that opens the door to a wide range of technologies allows to save European society up to 1 trillion euros over the next 30 years. We've seen that the technology diversification and renewable push pathways both confirm the essential role of hydrogen in achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Of course, policymakers need to balance many considerations: economic, social, environmental, geopolitical, to name but a few, when they design energy policy. From the perspective of energy system economics, the technology diversification pathway offers to European society advantages that policymakers should trade off against the other criteria. These advantages are notably that betting on more than one horse de-risks the achievement of the energy transition, that financing bottlenecks can more easily be avoided, and that the overall cost of the transition can be lowered. In conclusion, I'd like to underscore that what we've seen as an outcome of this modeling exercise is based on the timely implementation of 5 critical enablers. First, the cost of CO2 emissions needs to be fully internalized. Large-scale investment in clean technology will only happen if these investments are profitable. Second, clear and transparent accounting rules are needed to establish a common understanding of the CO2 content of different energy types or technologies. Innovation and learning by doing are key to bring the cost of new technologies down. And increasing capital intensity of the future energy system means that the cost of capital needs to be kept under control to avoid excessive financing costs. And finally, the market rules need to be clarified so hydrogen can be traded across Europe like any other commodity. With this, I'd like to thank you for your attention and pass back.
Johannes, thank you. We'll come back to Johannes for a bit more conversation in a few moments. Let me just introduce the panel briefly, and then I'll ask each individually to give a few introductory remarks of 3-4 minutes each. We have with us today Peter Handley. He's the head of unit at DG Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SMEs. And we also have Christian Bozoy. He's a member of the European Parliament and ITRE chair also. We have with us Don Summers, president of Gas Naturally, and Johannes, you've met, and Noah van Hulst, who's the hydrogen advisor at the International Energy Agency as well. Peter, you want to kick off this morning? I'm saying this morning because I'm in Washington. Most of you are in Europe today. So the floor is all yours, 3-4 minutes each, and then we'll go into more detailed discussion after that. Peter.
I think this report is a useful contribution to helping us deliver on the hydrogen strategy and also inform the work of the Clean Hydrogen Alliance. And it can also help with the transition pathways that we've announced we'll be developing for all the EU industrial ecosystems, because hydrogen is relevant for many of them. So thank you for the report. Secondly, I think it's clear that we're ready to move quite swiftly from the R&I stage into large-scale deployment. And we see a lot of appetite throughout the hydrogen value chain. As the Commissioner said, we've got a very large number of members of the Clean Hydrogen Alliance, and we just collected the investment pipeline, which we got over 1,000 projects, and they're widely distributed throughout the value chain. But 80% of them are relating to electrolyzers, and only 15-20% are based on natural gas pathways. And I think it's important to signal that our hydrogen strategy is very much about the benefit of hydrogen is if you're plugging it into renewable energy. Okay, there is also space for low carbon hydrogen, but this should not be seen as a pathway that needs to be occupying the majority of the space between now and 2050. It's very much a transitional type thing as far as we see it from the Commission perspective. The next point I'd like to make is that Europe really has an opportunity. It has a window of opportunity. We need to move fast because other parts of the world are moving just as fast. And we want to be the first to establish the market rules and make sure that the whole trading in hydrogen is done in a way which helps us and helps us not to replace today's dependency on oil and gas from imported sources with an equally significant import dependency for hydrogen, right? So let's make sure that we're, again, focusing much more on the renewable side of things. Last point, a lot of this is about investment. So the IPCI that we're putting together with the member states, the Alliance pipeline, recovery funds, there's a whole bunch of things which are there, including a whole range of European funds like the Innovation Fund, which can be used to help de-risk the early stages of these investments. Looking forward to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you. Christian, over to you. 3-4 minutes for opening remarks.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here, and sorry that at some point I'll have to speak in the plenary of European Parliament not so long from now, then I'll have to leave. First of all, I believe that it's clear for me, and the study also shows that the transition towards the decarbonized energy systems requires the full range of technology options to manage cost and provide the best chance of achieving climate neutrality goals. Both renewable and low carbon hydrogen are promising technologies. Thanks to their versatility, these clean fuels can be used across the energy supply chain as final energy and as feedstock. Hydrogen is rapidly growing attention in Europe and around the world. We discuss a lot in the Industry, Research and Energy Committee that I'm chairing the essential role of hydrogen in order to reach our goals, despite the fact that today hydrogen represents a modest fraction of the global and EU energy mix. The study that we are discussing today makes clear that we need low carbon hydrogen, so we should now develop a suitable policy framework and a EU CCS strategy that scales up CCS by 2030. And I am calling the European Commission to launch the CCUS strategy and to set up of the CCUS forum as mentioned in the energy system integration strategy. Hydrogen produced from natural gas using CCS can achieve near zero emissions, comparable to that produced from renewables, and can also deliver negative emissions by integrating bioenergy. It needs, therefore, be considered compatible on the way to a climate-neutral economy. I know it's a sensitive political discussion, but myself and also the country that I'm representing, Romania, and a lot of my colleagues from EPP are believing this. Low-carbon hydrogen plays a critical role in kickstarting a hydrogen economy. Renewable hydrogen catches up in the second half of the outlook period and meets the bulk of the additional demand growth if low-carbon hydrogen growth is limited by CO2 injection rate and storage availability. Instead of waiting for renewable hydrogen capacity to suffice on its own, Europe can accelerate the deployment of both technologies in parallel, building on existing production methods and infrastructure, keeping options open and enabling fair competition between all potential clean hydrogen production pathways will be essential to ensure sufficient volumes, avoid market fragmentation, and delivering cost-efficient emissions reduction across the EU. I believe that Europe can become a leader both in electrolyzer and CCUS technologies. One doesn't exclude the other. Rather, as said before, a mix of technologies increases our chances to reach net zero. Finally, the EU should also take into account the various starting points of the EU member states. The situation is not the same everywhere, and provide a common framework which can support all EU member states on their respective pathways to decarbonization. I believe that the results of the study underline the importance of repurposing existing natural gas infrastructure, protecting the value of the existing amortized infrastructure, and unlocking a lower cost option for hydrogen transportation. For me as ITRE chair, and also I believe for many of my colleagues, and I encourage you to share this study with many colleagues from European Parliament, not only from ITRE committee, but also from other relevant committees, the study are very timely and will be useful in the negotiations between European Parliament and Council for TENI regulation, for instance, but also when we'll debate, amend, and adopt Fit for 55 package. Thank you so much.
Christian Buzoy, thank you so much. Don Summers, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Brian, and it's really great to be here from sunny Hamburg. And thank you again, Johannes, for the report and the very important findings of the report. I share the view that alongside electrification, gas should be seen as the second pillar of the energy transition. And today the focus is on natural gas, but it will increasingly also be about low carbon gases such as hydrogen, and a credible path, and I'll reinforce that, a credible path to decarbonisation will require more than just electrification. So harnessing the strengths of both electricity and gas will be the most efficient and fastest, I don't know if that's the fastest way to create a sustainable low carbon economy. So I'm just reinforcing Peter's point earlier about the speed by which we have to move. Gas plays a vital role in the energy mix, and by working together with consumers, policymakers, and a broad range of stakeholders, we can really accelerate the advance of decarbonisation. And for those out there that know me, I am a great believer that innovation delivers solutions, and through continuous innovation and the development across the entire value chain, the gas industry are very much committed to achieving the net zero by 2050 and establishing the hydrogen market. And of course, markets of this size do not come about on their own. They have to be proactively cultivated. And policymakers, all of us, must take a decisive approach to encourage the emergence of these markets and promote investments in hydrogen technologies, all technologies, to help ensure that there is the required infrastructure and that we firmly anchor the use of hydrogen in more areas. I am absolutely convinced that hydrogen will become a cornerstone of European industry, and the EU strategy for hydrogen recognises that alongside renewable low-carbon hydrogen, production from natural gas reforming will play a fundamental role in providing the necessary volumes, talked about earlier by Johannes, over the next decades to develop an integrated hydrogen market. So I'll stop there, Brian, and I'm very much looking forward to the debate today.
Don, thank you so much. And let's go to Noah van Hulst. Noah.
Thank you very much, Brian. I hope everybody can hear me.
Perfectly.
Yes, I think that this report, kudos and congratulations to Johannes. I think it's a very useful contribution once again to show that clean hydrogen is indispensable for the energy transition and to achieve net zero emissions. And I will not repeat the reasons why. I think everybody has already heard about that. But let me focus on something that the IEA has been stressing in their net zero emissions roadmap. This report is very much in the same direction. And IEA has been saying that in order to make this happen, governments need to move much stronger, more boldly and faster. And this is true for hydrogen as well in Europe. So we really need to have these regulatory frameworks put in place in the member states and in the EU that create clearly defined markets for clean hydrogen. And we need adequate support schemes to de-risk investment. So there is a lot of appetite of private investors, but in order to really mobilize that private capital, so I'm not worried about the numbers that Johannes is mentioning of all that investment that is needed, but I'm worried, how do we put in place the clear signals that this can be mobilized? And we need to scale up a tremendous amount of clean hydrogen if we are successful. So that's why I think we need all types of low carbon hydrogen and renewable hydrogen. So not only renewable hydrogen, it will not simply be enough what we can produce there to meet those huge demands that industry needs to decarbonize. Now let me focus for my last bit on a thing that has not been mentioned enough in my view in the presentation, which is, yes, there is a tremendous potential to produce green hydrogen, wind offshore, solar, and we have gas with CCS. But then the demand will be in a different place. So how do you connect the supply sources to the demand centers? That has to be transported, that hydrogen, across Europe. And that's why it's incredibly important that we repurpose the gas pipelines in Europe increasingly to transport the hydrogen across Europe. And that's why the plan of gas infrastructure companies in Europe for a creation of a hydrogen backbone is incredibly important. And that includes storage sites, because we will need an incredible amount also of storage for seasonal storage of hydrogen. And that can be done in salt caverns. So a lot of the investment will also need to go into creating that infrastructure to have the whole value chain, demand and supply, connected through the infrastructure. And yes, we will also need imports. I agree with the report. I think rather optimistically saying only 10 to 15%. I would not be surprised if it is a lot more, because up to now, Europe is basically importing half of its energy in mainly fossil fuels. I would be really surprised, pleasantly surprised. I hope it's true that we can decrease that import dependency so much. But it's not a disaster if we import it from many diverse sources, including the ones mentioned in the report. But I think Australia and Chile are also huge potential exporters of clean hydrogen. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Yes, that also struck me in the report, though, as Johannes presented, the energy security dimension of this. And if we can't get from one or two suppliers, it's better to have the diversified approach to this as well. I also took out some other facts, a few facts I'm going to run through the discussion. First one, maybe Peter, you want to respond to this first. So Johannes mentioned the demand for hydrogen could exceed 100 million tons of H2 by 2050, with more than half of the total gross final energy consumption being supplied by non-electrified technologies in 2050. Peter, in terms of this finding and the EU's vision for hydrogen, particularly with the view of the policy initiatives that you have, how does this fit?
Well, we've said what we think should be the objective for 2030 and 2050 for clean hydrogen in the hydrogen strategy, but many people are starting to tell us that we may not be ambitious enough, and even for the 2030, we can maybe aim higher. So that we'll be able to test when we start to get these investments rolling out. And I did refer to the investment pipeline we collected through the Alliance. I gave a slightly misleading information. I said that 80% of the investment proposals were relating to electrolyzers. I should have said 80% of those relating to the production side were relating to electrolyzers. So I think if we can get these investments going, and more than 2/3 of the investments we've got are due to take place in the first 3 to 4 years, so they can really contribute to our short-term 2025 target, we'll see. Maybe we can readjust upwards our expectations for 2030 and also for 2050.
There's scope for more ambition, you think, within this as well? Okay. Anybody else want to add comment to that? All right. The second fact that struck me as well, European hydrogen production and use can grow dramatically with both low carbon and renewable hydrogen necessary to enable fast, low risk and more cost effective delivery of net zero with a mix of hydrogen types. And you heard different people mentioned this as well, and how important that particular mix would be. Christian, how do you see this in terms of our capacity to move forward? Should we focus on one side or another, or does it really matter from your perspective? How important is the mix of different hydrogen types here?
No, I really believe that we need a mix of different types of hydrogen. I think that it would be, as I said in my introductory remarks, that it is not worth to wait years, maybe decades, to have the possibility to produce hydrogen only from renewables, because now, of course, we don't have the installed capacity. You have a lot of ambitions regarding to renewables. RED II directive will come with much reinforced and much ambitious targets, European funds from RRF, from cohesion funds, from modernization fund, from many other sources are also helping member states to invest in renewables. And of course, the policies are there, and member states will be encouraged to use them, but it will not be enough. And we need to start building on hydrogen as soon as possible. That's why I think it's more political and ideological discussion than a practical one. I believe that we should use
I want to ask you about
great attention to low carbon hydrogen and of course to CCS.
Sure, I think we're some fault on the delay here. That's your perspective clearly from where you are on the EPP. Others as well, the Greens. What's the mood in the Parliament in general as well? Is it the same direction, or is there much discussion and difference in terms of ideology here?
it's of course a sensitive discussion. Until now, in many of the maybe discussions and even votes that we had, sometimes the majority is different, but we should continue to convince our colleagues, which are looking from a very pure and ideological perspective, and they're extremely enthusiastic, and it's good to be like this. But on practical terms, I think we need both types of hydrogens. And of course, with the development of CCS and CCUS, I believe that we could advance in this direction.
Okay, thank you. Johannes, just to ask you, the Fit for 55 package and the hydrogen decarbonized gas market package, how can we put these ambitions into action? You know, to your mind, what comes first? How does this happen?
Yeah, it's probably another question more for Peter and Christian. But I think what we can learn from the study is that if we take an economics perspective on the decarbonization, on the net zero objective, then we see that an awful lot needs to happen in terms of creating the necessary markets, the market rules to be able to trade hydrogen like electricity or natural gas is traded today, to have the necessary regulation in place that imports can work, and that the gas qualities are being defined. But I think most importantly, and I think this is also what Noah has alluded to, is the question of how the projects can be made profitable, in the sense that today the cost of CO2 is not sufficiently internalized, and that's why clean technologies or clean energy is more costly than dirty energy. And I think bridging this gap, this economic gap, that will then automatically trigger investments, is probably one of the most important things that need to happen.
Okay, Christian Buzzoy's got to run off to plenary in just a moment as well. We can't detain you from democracy. So just to ask you, just to follow on from what Johannes is saying there, how do we put this ambition into action? What's the most important dynamic that's got to take place here?
Yes, I'll have to speak on the European Medicine Agency, and I'm looking to the screen to see when my turn is. I really appreciate the European Commission hydrogen strategy. You know that we made some further proposals. We try to reinforce some issues. Some legislation will follow. So the good framework is here. The good legislative framework that will develop, amend, and adopt very soon. Then I saw many member states, and among the most strong and big member states from European Union, putting a lot of emphasis on hydrogen, having national strategies, and investing a lot, creating also the demand and the market for hydrogen. And all the others will follow. It's important to set the general rules, to set the targets, to give the financial incentives, and of course use some of the opportunities of European funds to build some of the infrastructure that we'll need. The political will is clear, the demand will be clear, we need hydrogen, essential to reach our goals, so it's important to implement what we are discussing.
Christian, thank you. I'll let you go, and we'll speak with you again soon. Take care. Don, just to follow on from that as well, from your side, the practical dimension of putting these ambitions into action, what strikes you as a matter of urgency?
Thanks, Brian. I think so. One thing is clear for me, and I just want to reinforce that all types of hydrogen are absolutely needed. You know, we shouldn't have this big debate over what colour it's about, making sure that we deliver in the most climate-friendly, cost-efficient way. And you know, we are transforming ourselves to make sure that our products are climate neutral. But we absolutely need an enabling framework to achieve the goal. And one thing for me is absolutely clear: we need to establish the hydrogen market now. And as was talked about earlier, a technology open energy policy can really reduce the costs of that energy transition and speed up the market development. So whether it's hydrogen produced from renewable energies or natural gas, it really doesn't matter. What does matter is that, again, it's produced in a climate-friendly and efficient way. So that would be, that's my perspective. And we should not leave any potential option untapped. So we need to establish that hydrogen market now and invest in technologies in order to deliver what we have promised.
We'll talk a bit more about creating the market later on as well. Another fact from the study, Noah, maybe you want to take this. So allowing low carbon hydrogen to contribute at its full potential along with renewable hydrogen could save Europe over 2 trillion euros through to 2050. In the context of the IEA's hydrogen net zero by 2050 roadmap, how does that sit with you?
Yeah, it's feasible, but Brian, I'm always very much focused on the next 10 to 15 years, because 2050, I mean, and this is not saying that it's not useful to have this, this view on what is the pathway to 2050. But let me turn it around. If we do not succeed in the next 10 to 15 years, globally, but also in Europe, to scale up hydrogen from small as it is now, the clean hydrogen, to really significant in the next 10 to 15 years, along the lines of the targets in Europe, then we are never going to be in a position to achieve those huge numbers for 2050. So that's what I'm always a little bit missing, to be honest, the sense of urgency, what needs to happen in the next 10 years. So we need much stronger policies and also faster. We are still a little bit in a business as usual mode of policy making in many member states and also including in Brussels. But we need it so fast. I mean, the target in 2024, that is basically means we need to enable final investment decisions on projects today, tomorrow, next week. And is the framework in place yet? No, it is not. So people are waiting. Projects are now waiting for final investment decision. And because of the uncertainty that is still there. So we need to take that away. So my plea is have a really also focus on some key projects for Europe and make them happen. Have tailor-made solutions, tailor-made private-public partnerships to take away that uncertainty and to enable final investment decisions this year, next year for some key projects going forward. Thank you.
Okay, I want to get some other comments from the others now, but just what do those projects, those pilots look like for you, Noah? What do you have in mind when you speak about that?
No, I cannot go. I'm not allowed to go into details, but I know that there are projects that are still waiting. For instance, I mean, the Commission rightly said the state aid rules need to be adjusted because we need to be able, if Johannes says we need to have support schemes in place to bridge the cost gap between, to make it economically feasible, the financial investment decisions, those support schemes need the approval of Brussels. They are working on the state aid rules, but it's not going fast enough. They need to be able, these investors, to take that decision tomorrow. So that's why I'm saying we need a little bit of a more unconventional policy making, that ahead of those adjustment of the rules that need to go through their process, the Commission needs to be able, and member states need to be able to decide today and tomorrow about significant projects that are otherwise are waiting, and we run the risk that private investors run away. Sorry.
Comment as well. Peter, you first.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with the need to get cracking on this really fast. The Innovation Fund has been heavily oversubscribed, particularly for hydrogen-related projects. So the second stage of the large projects has just gone through. I haven't seen the results yet, but I'm expecting a whole bunch of hydrogen projects in there. I've already referred to the 1,000+ projects collected under our investment pipeline. We will come out with the definitive investment pipeline at the second Hydrogen Forum meeting later this year. And then it's a question of guiding people to find the finance. And I don't know if you noticed, Noah, but at the recent Hydrogen Forum, we presented a financing compass which tells the companies how to find the right doorways for public funds, whether these are European funds or national funds. And then the IPCI. So Germany is leading 22 member states, and Norway, and DG Comp and ourselves and the JRC are helping. They've already got a pipeline of 500 projects which have gone through national calls for proposals. They're being sort of filtered now, and we're hoping to have one or even two IPCI packages pre-notified to the Commission during the summer, with the first investment decisions being ready for early next year. So I think we've got the message about the need for speed. I'm more worried about things on the reality side, like permitting. This could be a big bummer for getting in the way of achieving our objectives. So I think that's an issue in its own right.
Okay, Johannes. And then Don.
I can only support that sense of urgency to move quickly, because like, even if 2030 might look far away in terms of energy sector investments, it's actually around the corner, with the lifetimes of the installations easily exceeding 20, 25, 30 years. You only got very few investment cycles in the period to 2050. And if you want to arrive in 2050, you need to start, you need to go onto that road early, and that early is essentially now. And what we've done lately, just to give you a bit of a feeling for the numbers, we've started tracking all the announced hydrogen projects in Europe over the last 2.5 years. We've been adding these up, and under optimistic assumptions that they will come online and that they will produce properly the hydrogen, we can assess what today's projects would produce by 2030 and compare this against the target of 10 million tons of the EU hydrogen strategy. And in fact, even if all goes well, if all the projects that have been announced to date come online and work properly, are fully online by 2030, then they would only produce about 1/3 of that announced target. And if we mirror this then against the 30 million tons that we have in the Hydrogen for Europe study for 2030, then it becomes clear that there is really no time to waste to sort out the regulatory frameworks and get the investors ready to put steel in the ground.
Thank you. Don.
That's a great introduction, Johannes. So I'm going to steal some of your comments, but I don't know of any gas company that is not involved in hydrogen projects at the moment. Such projects involve like gas producers and also gas grid operators, the heating manufacturers, the local suppliers, heavy duty industries, and the energy intensive industries, and all of them are looking at how we can introduce and integrate hydrogen into their systems, and how they can adapt their existing technologies and their business strategies, and how they can contribute to finding a solution. So whether it's in the production and transport of hydrogen, the storage of CO2 via the very important carbon capture, or the adaptation of different appliances to use hydrogen, I don't know of anybody that, that most companies are doing this. And if I speak on behalf of Gas Naturally today, as opposed to the COO of an energy company, Gas Naturally members are leading the way, I would say, in operationalizing CCS technologies on the ground. And to Johannes's point, it's a proven technology. It's commercially available today, and we've got, I think, 19 large-scale CCS facilities currently operating globally, and 2 of which are in Europe, and another 20 nearly are to be built. And we've got a number of examples, but to Johannes's point, there are more than 50 projects planned in Europe to capture about 50 million tons of CO2 from those projects by 2030. So we have the will, we have the skill set, we have the mindset. We just need absolutely the framework and the policies in place to support the speed in the transition.
Thank you. We have lots of questions coming in now, so I'll encourage the our audience to send more. I'm going to come to those in just a couple of minutes as well. If you have a specific question for a specific person, please put that in and let us know where you're from as well, just out of interest. In the chat, which maybe you can't see, Noah has used the phrase earth shot. We need an earth shot for clean hydrogen, and which he says is the phrase that the US uses for the Department of the Environment here. I'm walking distance from the White House just now as well. I remember when President Obama was in Brussels, the only thing I took away from his press conference was that he was there to sell LNG, and the Parliament was trying to assist in the opening of ports for the shipping of LNG as well. Noah, in terms of this international dimension and by comparison with the US, how do you see this comparison with the US and Europe at the moment?
Well, the good news is for Europe that, Europe does have a comparative advantage. So I think we are, for all the reasons that have been mentioned, we are certainly, there's a huge momentum in Europe, and even a lot of international investors from outside of Europe are really looking at Europe. I mean, Gates Ventures, for instance, but many others as well. So there's a big appetite. But again, we need to deliver it on the ground now. So the US is now starting to step up. So they launched just an Earth shot Department of Energy of saying that they want to get the cost of clean hydrogen down to $1 in 2030, $1 per kilo of hydrogen, sorry, in 2030. That's a huge challenge that they put out there. But I think I like the term Earth shot in the sense that it gives kind of a mission that, we want to achieve that, we need to achieve that, and we need to mobilize everything we can to make it happen. And we should not forget, of course, Asia. I think Peter already alluded to that. I think Japan and Korea, Australia, they are moving, and China, not to forget, are moving fast on hydrogen. And they are building international value chains as well, and which is good, because in the end, it will be a global market where clean hydrogen can be traded as a global commodity. So it is not, I'm not saying that as in terms of bad, but if Europe wants to keep its current comparative advantage, we need really to step up to the plate and deliver faster on the ambitions.
Okay, just a quick comment in this, Peter, then I want to ask Don about what's happening on the ground practically as well. Peter, in the context, Noah just mentioned China here as well. We're in a competitive field, and it impacts everything else that we do in terms of our economy. How much of the Fit for 55 package builds that into its consciousness, and are we too focused on the environment to the detriment of the competitive global situation as well?
Two key words for me, two key concepts for me are resilience and open strategic autonomy. We've seen so much disruption in supply chains in the last couple of years, and not so reassuring geopolitical outlook. So this is why I made the remark earlier. I think we should be trying to prioritize doing a large proportion of this hydrogen economy with the expertise and the leadership that we already have and the investment appetite here in Europe. You cannot ignore that if you're going to replace import dependency for oil and gas with import dependency for hydrogen, then you're missing a trick. You're missing an opportunity, because this has the potential through the renewable pathway to give you more resilience and open strategic autonomy. And don't forget that if you're creating hydrogen in Chile or Australia or South Africa or wherever, you're converting it to something. It's very difficult, and it has a greenhouse gas emission footprint if you're shipping it halfway across the world, and then you're converting it back into something usable on the other side. So there are energy security and sustainability issues, I believe, that need to be addressed.
Thank you. Don, just before we take some questions, the natural gas industry is going to go through a big change with the impact of hydrogen. From your perspective, what's happening on the ground, and what kind of preparations are being made for this?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I can assure you that the entire value chain is working on ideas on how to deliver important projects. Grid operators are working on possible ways to transport hydrogen via existing pipelines through blending, but also repurposing of existing natural gas pipelines or building new ones. Gas producers have projects to produce green, blue, turquoise hydrogen. With respect to blue hydrogen, the development of CCS technology is absolutely critical, and I keep reinforcing that point in terms of delivering on our promises, and also low-cost clean energy. So, the point I made earlier about we have the capability, the skill sets, the will, the technology, and enable to contribute to advancing decarbonisation. So I don't know, and I said this before, I don't know of any gas company that's not involved in hydrogen projects, and they're all looking at how to integrate hydrogen into their systems. And I mentioned the number of projects that's happening with regards to CCS in Europe, globally, and what's in the pipeline before 2030. But gas naturally members are leading the way in operationalising in a practical way the technology on the ground. And it is a proven technology. It's commercially available today, with, like I said, 19 large-scale CCS facilities currently operating globally, 2 of them in Europe, and with many other projects like in the pipeline. So all of them, one thing is clear: they need the stable framework conditions, and coherent policies are absolutely needed to enable the innovation and create the economies of scale and to reduce the cost going forward. And by supporting investment in all of these projects, then makes the projects more attractive to private financing, and creating the business cases for investments for the innovative technologies like CCUS. So lots going on the ground, and I'll just reinforce what everybody else is saying. There's a sense of urgency. Everybody's heading in the direction, of 2050 climate neutral. We just need the stable framework in order to be able to deliver on our promises. But it's definitely, the train has definitely left the station, Brian.
Thank you. But is that train hydrogen powered? That's the question. Thank you, Don. And Johannes, you wanted to come back with a quick comment on the imports as well.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, just wanted to give maybe a perspective from the study on imports. So what we've done is we've looked in great detail at the amount of hydrogen that Europe could import from outside Europe. And we've done this really from an economic perspective. So adding up the different costs of the supply chain. And what we've learned is that the landed cost of the hydrogen in Europe really depends on a wide variety of parameters. And how these parameters will pan out in the future determines essentially what the share of the hydrogen imports in Europe are from an economic perspective. But I think what we shouldn't forget, and that's what Peter but also Noah have alluded to, that it's not just about the economics when we look at the imports. Imports can help complement missing domestic production in serving demand. That's the supply gap that I've also alluded to. But it can also, the European energy transition might reshuffle the cards, the geopolitical cards, wider than Europe. And as such, I think it's a legitimate foreign affairs question whether this is a good moment to strike new alliances with old partners. And last but not least, climate change is a global phenomenon. And Europe gains nothing if it achieves net zero in isolation. And developing trade relationships with developing countries can certainly help to build up a hydrogen economy in these countries, which will then help them to decarbonize more easily. So when we look at the imports, we should always take this comprehensive perspective on trade.
Johannes, thank you. The Rubik's Cube of our environment and trade future. Let's go to some questions. One from Daniel Bonaway. He asks, what is required to make the existing transport and gas cavern storage structure H2 ready, and what is required to get us there? Maybe Noah, then Don. Noah.
Well, it's relatively easy. I mean, we have looked at it very carefully and very early on in the Netherlands, and I can tell you that maybe you missed that announcement, but actually only a week ago, I think, the Dutch government officially asked the gas infrastructure company Gasunie, to which I'm an advisor as well. They asked the gas infrastructure company Gasunie to basically to build that, to construct and start repurposing the gas pipelines to transport hydrogen. And Gasunie, the technical experts, have seen that yes, it can be done. You need some adjustments. You need to. I don't want to become too technical. You need to replace some compressors, etc. But it is relatively easy to do, and it costs not more than 20% of building a new pipeline for hydrogen. So it's a huge opportunity, not only for the Netherlands, but for all European countries which have a good gas infrastructure to start repurposing. And of course, it will take time. So the gas volumes will go down and the transportation of hydrogen will then take over. It will take decades. But again, as with other things, you have to start now to start building that infrastructure in order to be ready in the next decades to come.
Thank you. Dawn, anything to add in this?
I think it was an excellent answer, and just reinforcing the point that I made earlier around it's already happening. People are already, organizations, companies are already looking at repurposing existing kit, building new kit. We have the skills, we have the technical expertise, we have the will. It's about the stable framework that's required to continue that, but it's heading in the right direction. Lots have been done, lots to do, but we're moving forward.
Okay, Peter?
Well, clearly there's going to be a need for some repurposing, but there may also be a need for some dedicated hydrogen infrastructure as well. Apart from the 10E, which has been referred to by the ITRI chair, we're doing a project with the Joint Research Centre at the moment, which will allow us to do some investment planning, some scenario building around what kind of infrastructure would be needed for hydrogen to support the needs of energy-intensive industries. So it's only part of the picture, but our colleagues from DG Energy will also be looking at it from the broader hydrogen infrastructure perspective.
Thank you. A question, maybe Johannes, maybe you can answer this. Professor Tony Mills asks, why is there no place for oxy-hydrogen generation to replace the century-old compressed gas cylinder use for metal treatment? Can you answer that, Johannes? Or anyone?
I don't think so.
Okay, anyone else want to have a go at that? No, fine, okay. This one question may have been for Christian, who's now gone. Maybe someone else can take maybe Peter can answer this. Any info on 10E regulation legislative timeline? For example, when will ITRI adopt its final report? Thanks, says from Katja. Peter?
Yeah, you need to ask the guy that's left.
Yes, we will follow up with them afterwards. Thank you, Katja, for your question. And we'll come back to those in just a moment as well. In terms of our Europe's ambition, we talked a lot about the energy security side of this, to the investments. Peter, earlier you mentioned about the 1,000 projects I think were funded. That seems like a lot for any European funding structure. Are you excited that there's so much activity in this sector? Will this does this give the stimulus for private investors to come on board, or are we still at the early stages and there's much more work to be done?
Well, if the alliance members a month to come up with their projects, and so I think it's pretty surprising and amazing that we got so many projects in such a short time. So my commissioner is very excited, which means logically I'm very excited too, even though the task of analysing them and helping the companies to kind of find each other through the matchmaking process which we've launched is going to be quite a lot of work between now and November. But I think it is important work. We've got the round tables of the alliance as well, which are looking at the potential of these projects. But I'm quite optimistic. I'm quite optimistic about getting projects funded and off the ground pretty quickly. But I do come back to that point, which no one else has picked up on. There's quite a lot of permitting involved in the whole energy transition sphere. quite a lot of the Green Deal is if you don't get things permitted, if you don't do the things for the recovery fund in good time, you're going to find blockages. So I know that people like the wind sector are very worried about this, because it's all very well saying by 2030 we want so much offshore wind capacity, but if you can't actually get things approved, it's not going to happen, is it? I think that's an issue that needs to be delved into.
Johannes, in terms of the report, how do you see this regulatory approach and the permitting? Do you see this as a real bottleneck, or is this being streamlined more effectively?
I fully agree with Peter that this is a big issue, the social acceptance, and I think that's also where the permitting comes from, is because you just don't want to let everybody build no matter what, and I think the energy transition, and that's independent actually of the type of energy or the fuel, will always face some resistance from people. So social acceptance, and that's, I think hydropower is an excellent example, is in the sense it's the biggest source of renewable energy still today, but it is also highly contested whenever a new hydropower project is being developed. We see the issue with wind. We see the issue to a lesser degree maybe with PV, but we certainly also see it with CCS, with nuclear, with many clean technologies. So what we've done, how we've approached this in the study, is that we've assumed that the European citizen buys into the idea of this enormous, formidable challenge of achieving a net zero emission by 2050, and will be ready to accept windmills, CCS, and in some regions also nuclear power. But that's certainly something that needs to be discussed, and that's also something that everybody needs to work on, because companies who want to do clean energy projects, they need to have also the social license to operate, and that's why it is very important to take the citizen with us.
Thank you. We're coming close on time, so I think we'll go to your wrap-up sound bites now as well. Noah, you want to kick off your final remarks?
Oh, sorry. I wanted still to comment on Johannes's point on public acceptance. I think it's a critical point. The good news is, I think, is that there's a lot of enthusiasm also at a local level, also from citizens, about particularly green hydrogen, and that's very good. It also offers local solutions, but we do need to be very aware of that, particularly in the new applications in transportation. You need to immediately have the highest safety standards, because if anything would go wrong with a refueling station or anything major, that could give a big backlash. So we need to be very aware of that the new applications where you come very close to the citizens, you need to ensure the highest safety standards around there. Luckily, there's a lot of experience there, but we need to build on that. And we need to respect that from the very beginning. Otherwise, we would undermine that. No, I would, in terms of wrapping up, I would just want to repeat what I said before. I think huge ambitions are great. Europe has a fantastic position to make that happen. But again, we need to be very strong and faster in implementing it in the member states as well as in Brussels, and including all the possible barriers. We need to tackle it in kind of earth-shot approach that I think is required in order to make it happen, because the challenge is huge.
No, thank you. Peter?
2021 is the year of the Commission putting forward the enabling framework. The Alliance is doing excellent work identifying barriers, so that will come into us. We can deal with those things. We're doing everything we can to accelerate the whole investment side of this, and I can only reiterate what everyone said. We have a real need for speed.
Thank you, Peter. Dawn?
I'm going to quote that, Peter, a real need for speed. That's something that I'll use going forward. But for me, a lot has been done. A lot is available. We have a lot to do. But most important is to continue to innovate, develop, learn, and make our technologies cheaper. I I would also summarise that gas should be seen as a second pillar of the energy transition alongside electrification, and that a core learning from the great study that Johannes has provided for us is that CCS is it's reinforcing that CCS is absolutely essential for us to achieve our climate neutrality, and we need to scale up fast. And my final commentary is that I absolutely believe, and I'm convinced, that hydrogen will become a cornerstone of our European industry, and I'm also convinced that it will need all types of hydrogen, all types of colours. And I'm looking forward to the speed, Peter, by which we can implement the framework and get going, or continue to get going.
Don, thank you very much. And soundbites over to Johannes.
Yeah, so I think our study has shown it very clearly that there is no business as usual trajectory to net zero. The energy system as we know it today needs to change deeply and profoundly, and we all need to accept that. But I think the good news is, if you look at our pathways, you can see that it is still feasible, and here coming back to the speed argument, that if we start doing it now, we can avoid dangerous climate change.
Thank you. On that note, thanks to Commissioner Verlaine for taking the time to speak with us today, to Peter, Christian, Don, Johannes, and Noah for an excellent discussion, really worthwhile. Enjoyed having you on the program today. And to our EURACTIV team, who you don't see, but they're always in the background to make this happen, Malta, Zoran, Matea, and Tamara. And for our support today from Hydrogen for EU, really appreciate that. If you're in Washington, I wish you a good morning, and in Brussels, in Europe, a good afternoon.